In the summer of 1876, a pivotal figure in one of history's most notorious battles came to light, a man who endured the brutal aftermath and lived to share his story. But what revelations did Sergeant Daniel Kanipe uncover about the Battle of Little Bighorn? Join us as we uncover the untold story behind the man who witnessed it all. Don't forget to subscribe and follow our channel for more fascinating historical journeys. On June 25, 1876, Sergeant Daniel Kanipe of the U.S. Army took part in the Battle of Little Bighorn as a member of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, specifically within Company C. Kanipe played a crucial role in the battle, as he was one of the few survivors, and his personal account became a vital source of historical knowledge. His courage during the battle was acknowledged, and he later provided important testimony during the Court of Inquiry, which aimed to examine the events leading up to and during the battle. Kanipe's involvement in the conflict is especially significant because, unlike many of his fellow soldiers, he survived the fierce combat, allowing him to recount the actions of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer in the 7th Cavalry. His testimony offered valuable insight into the movements and decisions made by Custer and his officers, helping to understand the outcome of the battle. After the battle, Kanipe continued his service in the U.S. Army. Over time, he wrote a memoir titled The Kanipe Story, which became an important historical record. His account of the events at Little Bighorn has been studied by historians for its authenticity and detailed viewpoint, providing an essential primary source for understanding the battle from the perspective of one of its survivors. The memoir, though personal, delivers a structured and clear account of the battle's progression, including the harsh conditions faced by the soldiers and the battle's outcome. While Kanipe's personal experience is central to understanding the Battle of Little Bighorn, his narrative is also part of a larger military operation that had been progressing for weeks. The meticulous details of the regiment's journey, the decisions made along the way, and the eventual clash at Little Bighorn all contribute to a broader understanding of the historical context in which the battle occurred. The decisions leading up to the engagement, including the reconnaissance missions and the discovery of the Indian Trail, reveal the complexity of the campaign and the challenges faced by both sides of the conflict. As the sun began to set, we brewed some coffee and set out to walk the trail throughout the night. We continued our march the next morning, brewing more coffee before resuming our journey along the route until midday. However, by that time, General Reno, the detachment commander, determined that our 10-day rations were running low, and we turned back down the Rosebud River. At the confluence of the Rosebud and Yellowstone rivers, we encountered the remaining 6 companies of the regiment under the command of General Custer. The department commander, General Terry, was also present. It was here that Custer had been arrested. The arrest was allegedly due to his stance against the post merchants who had received exclusive rights to trade at various posts. These concessions had been revoked following scandals under President Grant's administration, which led to a tense situation at the posts. The post merchants held a monopoly over supplies, and it was impossible to purchase goods without first going through these vendors. For example, a glass of whiskey at the post cost 25 cents, and the serving sizes were typically small. Custer's arrest stemmed from his decision to establish a maximum price for goods, challenging the practices of these merchants. Despite his arrest, Custer was not entirely sidelined. He was accompanied by other senior Army officers and was granted command at the location we had reached. On July 22nd, his group received 15 days' worth of supplies from the steamship Far West, which was docked on the river. Custer's group was also equipped with 2 Gatling guns and 2 Rodman guns, which he eventually surrendered to General Gibbon. Gibbon transported the guns across the river because Custer believed his forces could manage without them. In hindsight, this decision is often regarded as a mistake. Had Custer retained one of the Rodman cannons and fired it even once, it is believed that the Native American forces would not have been able to escape as they did. If Custer had kept the Gatling gun, it is speculated that the outcome of the battle might have been entirely different. The Native American forces would likely have been slowed or halted, and the massacre that followed might never have occurred. Reflecting on this decision, I believe the presence of a Gatling gun would have significantly altered the course of the battle. In fact, had the guns been used effectively, there is a strong possibility that the tragic events of Custer's defeat could have been avoided. The absence of those weapons at a critical moment left Custer's forces vulnerable, contributing to the catastrophic outcome at Little Bighorn. On June 22nd, the regiment broke camp and began marching. Custer issued orders that night for all directions to be communicated through hand signals, with no further bugle calls to be sounded. The fire was to be kept to a minimum, used only for making coffee. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the march, which resumed the following morning, June 23rd. The regiment continued its march throughout the day, making steady progress until nearly dusk, at which point they set up camp. The next morning, June 24th, the march continued. On that day, the regiment reached a location where the Native American groups they were pursuing had conducted both a war dance and a sun dance. The ground at this site was firm and smooth, likely due to the effects of the dance rituals. In addition, the Native Americans had constructed temporary brush huts from cottonwood trees, indicating they had been at the location for some time. While at this site, 6 Crow Indian scouts who were part of the regiment's contingent made a significant discovery: the scalp of a white man. It was later determined that the scalp belonged to a soldier under the command of General Gibbon. The Crow scouts, who had long-standing animosity toward the Sioux, were visibly excited upon finding the scalp. They were particularly pleased to see it hanging from a willow branch, a clear sign of their victory over a member of the opposing force. The scouts' reaction was intense. They broke into celebration, shouting, dancing, and yelling. The discovery of the scalp sparked their enthusiasm, but it was also a reminder of the violent and brutal nature of the conflict. Their joy was likely driven not just by the scalp itself, but by the symbolism of striking a blow against the Sioux, whom they detested. The Crow scouts' behavior seemed to reflect the deep-seated hostility between the tribes, with the scalp representing a form of vengeance or triumph over their rivals. Had the scalp belonged to a Sioux warrior, the day would have likely been even more intense for the scouts. The discovery of a Sioux scalp would have further heightened their fervor, potentially leading to even more extreme reactions. The emotional response of the Crow scouts underscores the passionate and often violent emotions tied to the conflict between Native American tribes, as well as between the Native Americans and the U.S. Army. After the scalp was discovered, it was brought back to General Custer. He examined it before passing it along to the men. The scalp was kept for some time, eventually ending up in the saddle pockets of the oldest line sergeant in Kanipe's company, Sergeant Finley. The scalp remained there until Finley's death, a stark reminder of the brutality and the high stakes of the ongoing conflict. The possession and transfer of the scalp among the soldiers and scouts highlights the way in which such symbols of war were treated as both trophies and markers of success in the harsh realities of the frontier. On June 24th, the regiment marched throughout the day, covering significant ground. Later that evening, around 10 o'clock, the Indian scouts who had been sent out earlier returned. It was dark by then, but the summer nights in that region allowed for relatively good visibility, with enough light to read even at 9 o'clock. That night, the troops were given orders to pack up their equipment and prepare to saddle up. The regiment then began marching through the night, with General Custer leading the way toward the confluence of the Little Bighorn and Rosebud rivers. The terrain along this route included a gully, which Custer identified as a suitable location for the regiment to hide and remain concealed for an extended period. The gully provided a strategic advantage, offering cover and an opportunity to surprise the enemy if needed. However, as the regiment entered the gully at a hard trot and gallop, an unfortunate incident occurred. Quartermaster Sergeant Hurst lost some hard bread from the pack train supplies. Upon learning of the lost supplies, General Custer instructed Sergeant Hurst to return to the location where the bread had fallen and retrieve it. Upon arriving, the sergeant found 2 Native Americans helping themselves to the bread. When the Indians saw the approaching soldiers, they quickly fled the scene. Sergeant Hurst reported the incident to General Custer upon his return to camp. In response, Custer ordered the regiment to saddle up once again. Initially, it seemed that Custer planned to wait until morning to launch a surprise attack on the Indians, but given that the Native Americans were now aware of their presence, Custer decided to act immediately. The regiment then marched up the divide, stopping to regroup. General Custer left the main group for 2 hours, accompanied by 2 scouts and Henry Voss, the head trumpeter. During this time, Custer assessed the situation and developed a plan for the next phase of the operation. Upon his return, he made a strategic decision to split the regiment into 3 detachments to cover more ground and increase their chances of engaging the enemy. General Custer assigned 3 troops, A, M, and G, to Major Reno, entrusting him with a portion of the regiment to pursue a specific mission. Captain McDougal was tasked with leading the pack train and Troop B, while Captain Benteen received 3 additional troops, H, K, and D. Custer retained command of Troops C, E, A, and F, keeping these units under his direct control. Once the new assignments were made, the regiment began to move out, leaving the location where they had briefly halted. The reorganization of the troops and the decision to march on was a clear indication that General Custer intended to press forward with the mission, despite the challenges they had already faced and the increasing knowledge that the Native American forces were aware of their presence. Major Reno's position was to the left of General Custer, with Captain Benteen positioned further to his left. This arrangement clearly indicated that the plan was to approach the Indian camp from 3 different angles. The regiment's pack train, under the leadership of Captain McDougall, was tasked with advancing up the main Indian trail, potentially to disrupt any possible escape routes or communication. The regiment proceeded down what is now known as Benteen's Creek, following the waterway until they reached a crossing. At this location, they discovered an abandoned Indian camp. The fires were still smoldering, a sign that the camp had been recently vacated. As the soldiers investigated, they found one of the surviving teepees, inside of which lay the body of a deceased Indian. General Custer immediately ordered the teepee to be burned, a strategic move likely intended to eliminate any remaining trace of the camp and discourage the Indians from returning. When Major Reno arrived on the scene, General Custer directed him to cross Benteen Creek, which he did without delay. At the same time, General Custer advanced with 3 of his companies down the creek, pushing further into the area in search of the main Indian force. As they neared the junction where Benteen's Creek meets the Little Bighorn River, approximately a quarter of a mile away, I spotted Indians on top of the bluffs overlooking the river. I immediately informed First Sergeant Bobo of the sighting, who in turn notified General Custer. Upon hearing this, the general looked up, and Troops C, I, and F were ordered to make their way toward the bluffs to investigate further. At this point, my unit, Troop C, was led by General Custer's brother, Captain Tom Custer. Despite pushing hard and riding quickly, we arrived at the summit of the bluffs only to find that the Indians had already disappeared. However, the teepees of the camp were visible from the bluffs, stretching for miles in every direction. It became clear that the Indian camp had been large, and its occupants had either fled or dispersed into the surrounding landscape. Our Crow Indian scouts, who were familiar with the area and had previous knowledge of the Indians' movements, made plans to sneak down to the camp and potentially capture a few ponies left behind. However, as they attempted to descend, they were shot at by the remaining Indians, forcing them to retreat. Among the scouts with us on the bluffs were Bloody Knife Reeve, a Ree or Ricara, Curly, a Crow, and Chief Scout Mitch Buey. Despite the danger, they remained on the bluffs with us, watching the movements below. At this point, General Custer directed us to gallop to the far end of the bluffs. His plan was to launch a coordinated attack on the Indian camp from above, now that the men from the 4 companies under his command had begun shouting and making noise upon spotting the camp in the valley below. The loud commotion likely alerted the Indians to the presence of the approaching soldiers, which would have made a surprise attack more difficult, but it also indicated that the soldiers were preparing to engage the enemy. The situation at this point was tense, with the soldiers poised for action and the Indians aware of the incoming threat. The presence of the scouts and the strategic positioning of the troops suggested that General Custer was aiming for a swift strike, hoping to capitalize on the confusion caused by the soldiers' movements and the visibility of the camp. Despite the early signs of tension, the outcome of this confrontation remained uncertain as the soldiers prepared for the next phase of the battle. Sergeant Finkel was riding near me, and both of us were close to Captain Tom Custer. As we rode along, Finkel called out to me, his voice strained. He yelled that his horse was struggling and that he was nearing his breaking point. I responded to him, urging him to continue, saying, "Finkel, if you can, come on." He pulled back slightly, retreating a little to try to gain control of his horse. At this point, Captain Custer gave me an order to return and find McDougall and the pack train in order to deliver General Custer's instructions. The captain told me to relay the message. Tell McDougall to move the pack train directly to the high ground. Do not stop to fix the packs if they come loose. Slice them off. Act quickly. I understood the urgency of the situation and turned back to find the pack train. Although I initially considered it an unfortunate task, it turned out to be a decision that would later save my life. Had Sergeant Finkel not fallen back a few minutes earlier, it was likely he would have received the orders. As it was, I found myself tasked with delivering them, And in retrospect, I can only think how fortunate I was to have taken that route. As I rode back, I could see the dust rising from the pack train in the distance, forming a small cloud. At the same time, my group and the rest of the regiment continued down into the Indian camp, unaware of the developments that would soon unfold. I couldn't help but recall General Custer's final remarks as the soldiers charged ahead. We all rode at a full clip, and as we moved, the men on horseback cheered loudly as they climbed the hill. Some of them were riding so fast that they galloped past General Custer, unable to control their horses. The general, seeing this, called out to them, "Hold your horses, boys. For all of us, there are plenty down there." His words were a reminder of the battle ahead and the need to remain composed. After the soldiers continued their march, I rode back to the pack train to deliver the orders to Captain McDougall. Once I had done that, I was instructed to carry the orders on to Captain Benteen as well. When I arrived at Captain Benteen's position, I learned that Major Reno had been retreating from the base of the bluffs. At the same time, McDougall and his men had ridden up to the top of the hill to offer support. Behind them, the Indians were shouting and shooting, and soldiers were falling all around them. As the situation quickly escalated, it became clear that the battle was already in full force. The Indians, in a constant state of motion, would leap onto the fallen soldiers and scalp them before we had a chance to intervene. The brutality of the encounter was evident, as the Indians took advantage of every opportunity to strike, and the soldiers were overwhelmed. The chaos of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. As I stood observing the scene, it was clear that we were facing a significant struggle. The pack train had been moved, and the soldiers had begun their assault, but the Indians' relentless tactics were beginning to take their toll. The dire situation only deepened as the soldiers continued to face pressure from all sides. It was a pivotal moment, with the possibility of survival growing slimmer as the battle raged on. As Dr. DeWolf reached the top of the slope, he was killed by enemy fire. Tragically, he had been just a few paces away from reaching safety, which might have spared his life. His death underscored the precarious nature of the battlefield, where survival often came down to mere moments or steps. While following Captain Benteen back toward the main group, I noticed some Indians rushing along. Mistaking them for hostile forces, I prepared to fire a few rounds. However, I soon realized they were actually scouts attempting to escape the central conflict. Terrified by the escalating violence, they fled the battlefield entirely, continuing their retreat as far as the Powder River, leaving Major Reno's command in the process. After delivering the instructions to Captain Benteen, I rode with the battalion back to the top of the ridge, where we joined forces with the units under Major Reno and Captain McDougall. By this point, the Indians had positioned themselves between our group and General Custer, preventing me from rejoining my company. Faced with the escalating attacks, we were forced to retreat and establish skirmish lines. Major Reno's attempt to march out on the bluffs and confront the Indians resulted in a fierce engagement. Before we could effectively organize our defenses, several of our men were killed, and their bodies could not be retrieved. The Indians continued to fire relentlessly throughout the day, keeping us under siege. As night fell, they paused, gathering to regroup. By the morning of June 26th, the attacks resumed with renewed intensity. The second day of fighting was equally brutal, with constant gunfire exchanged between both sides. While I cannot give an exact count, it was evident that our forces managed to inflict significant casualties on the attacking Indians. Despite our efforts, we were in a dire situation. 68 men in our camp were injured, and we were completely cut off from access to water. The cries of the wounded, desperately pleading for water, were heartbreaking to hear. However, any attempt to retrieve water was met with deadly consequences. Men who ventured out to the river were shot before they could return, leaving the injured without relief. The suffering of the wounded added a tragic dimension to the already dire circumstances. One detail that remains vivid in my memory is the sound of the first gunshot fired during the battle. The bullet struck the ground near me, passing directly under my horse's belly. It was a moment that emphasized the chaotic and dangerous environment we were facing. As the fighting raged on, the toll on our forces became increasingly evident. 2 officers, Lieutenants Harrington and Sturgis, along with 14 other soldiers, were never recovered. Reports emerged that during the Indians' nighttime celebrations, they had decapitated the missing men and dragged their severed heads in gruesome displays. The loss of these men, coupled with the stories of what befell them, cast a grim shadow over the already harrowing battle. By the end of the conflict, 56 men from our group on the hill had been killed. The devastation was immense, with the hill serving as a grim testament to the ferocity of the battle. The combination of relentless attacks, the suffering of the wounded, and the inability to reconnect with General Custer's forces left an indelible mark on all who survived. The experience remains a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the battlefield and the high cost of the decisions made during those fateful days. On June 26th, the firing persisted throughout the day as the battle raged on. By late evening, signs of movement were observed in the Indian camp. The women in the camp were busy packing their belongings, preparing to move, while the warriors continued their assault on our position. Despite the constant gunfire, the gradual dismantling of the camp indicated that the Indians were planning to withdraw. By the morning of June 27th, the camp had been completely abandoned. There was no sign of any Indians in the area. With the immediate threat gone, we took the opportunity to make coffee, retrieve some water, and provide whatever assistance we could to the injured soldiers. It was a somber and quiet morning as we tried to regroup after the prolonged siege. At approximately 10 a.m., General Gibbon and his forces arrived, accompanied by General Terry. Their arrival was a moment of immense relief, and the troops greeted them with enthusiastic cheers. However, the mood quickly shifted when General Terry, overcome with emotion, broke into tears. His reaction revealed the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded. General Terry soon reported the devastating news. General Custer and the 4 companies under his command had been completely destroyed. The sight of the battlefield below, with the bodies of over 200 troops scattered across the valley, confirmed the extent of the loss. For many of us, it was a moment of grim realization, dispelling any hope that Custer's group might have been trapped in a similar situation as ours and could still be holding out. Later that afternoon, I was given permission to accompany Captain Benteen to the battlefield. As we surveyed the area, the scale of the devastation became painfully clear. The bodies of fallen comrades lay where they had fought, a stark reminder of the battle's ferocity. Among the dead, I recognized several acquaintances and soldiers I had known personally. I found Sergeants Finkel and Finley among the fallen. The sight of Sergeant Finley was particularly haunting. He lay at the head of his horse, Carlo, with 12 arrows protruding from his body. The gruesome scene epitomized the brutality of the engagement and the immense cost of the confrontation. The battlefield was a grim testament to the tragic events that had unfolded, leaving a profound impact on all who witnessed its aftermath. The bodies of the fallen soldiers had been lying exposed in the sun for 2 days, bloodied and severely mutilated. The women and younger members of the Indian groups had stripped the men of their clothing and repeatedly assaulted their faces with tomahawks or filled their bodies with arrows. This behavior made it clear which of the men had still been alive when the Indians encountered them. Their brutality was reserved solely for the living. The dead were left untouched. Every body on the battlefield had been stripped of clothing, leaving no personal belongings behind. The Indians had taken everything of value from the soldiers. It was estimated that the Indians had also obtained around $25,000 in cash, as the soldiers had recently been paid at Powder River Camp before embarking on this campaign. The money, however, had little use for the soldiers during the mission, as there was nothing to purchase in the field. As I surveyed the scene, I could identify the place where the last of Custer's men had fallen. The bodies were clustered together in a small pile, marking their final stand. Among them was General Custer himself. His body lay atop several of his men, with only the small of his back touching the ground. He was surrounded by the dead, a stark and somber image of the desperation and finality of their struggle. A gunshot had pierced his heart, ending his life amidst the chaos. This final group of fallen soldiers was near Captain Tom Custer, the general's brother, as well as Lieutenant Calhoun, the general's brother-in-law, who had been in command of H Troop. Their proximity in death spoke to the familial ties that bound them, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The scene was grim, highlighting the ferocity of the fight and the devastating losses suffered by Custer's command. The sheer number of Native Americans involved in the conflict was staggering. Excluding the women, there were an estimated 4,000 warriors actively engaged in the battle, with a total force of 12,000 to 15,000 Native Americans present overall. Against such overwhelming numbers, Custer and his men stood little chance of survival. The disparity in forces underscored the hopelessness of their position and the inevitability of their defeat. By the time the battlefield was examined, there were no living witnesses left to recount the final moments of Custer and his 4 companies. The scene was one of utter silence and desolation, with only the bodies of the fallen bearing testimony to the fierce and one-sided nature of the conflict. It was a tragic and sobering end to a campaign that had begun with high hopes and had culminated in a devastating loss. Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche, was the only known survivor from Custer's battalion at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Comanche sustained 7 gunshot wounds during the conflict and was later found amidst the aftermath of the slaughter. Alongside the bodies of fallen soldiers, many dead Native Americans were also discovered scattered across the battlefield. Within the remnants of the Native American camp, 3 standing teepees were found, inside which approximately 75 deceased Indians were located. However, it was impossible to determine how many more bodies had been removed as the Native American forces moved their camp following the battle. The scale of their casualties remained uncertain, as their ability to quickly dismantle and relocate their camp allowed them to conceal the full extent of their losses. During my search of the battlefield, I came across an Indian dressed in buffalo robes and blankets. To my shock, he carried 4 women's scalps, 2 of which had long red hair, strung together on a cord as long as my arm. The sight of these scalps was both gruesome and deeply unsettling. Overwhelmed by the horror of the scene, I immediately dropped them, unwilling to keep such a disturbing artifact, even for evidence. After the battle concluded, the priority shifted to burying the dead and caring for the injured. The bodies of our fallen comrades were interred in shallow graves on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the wounded faced the arduous task of being transported to the steamboat Far West, which had traveled as far up the river as possible to assist. The injured soldiers were carried to the steamer, which then retreated down to the Yellowstone River to ensure they received medical treatment. Despite the severity of their injuries, the majority of the wounded soldiers miraculously survived. Among those who endured was Comanche, Captain Keogh's horse, whose resilience made him a symbol of survival. In recognition of Comanche's unique role in the battle, General Headquarters issued an order for the horse to be retired and cared for with honor. Comanche lived out the rest of his days in a box stall under the care of a 7th Cavalry Band soldier. The horse became a ceremonial figure, often leading the regiment in dress parades, draped in a black mourning cloth as a somber reminder of the events at Little Bighorn. Following the battle, the Native American forces dismantled their camp and moved on, leaving the site of their victory behind. My regiment, heavily battered and with many casualties, was in no condition to pursue them. The combination of severe injuries, exhaustion, and the strategic disadvantage of our position made any attempt at a counteroffensive impossible. The Native American forces, having secured a decisive victory, were able to retreat without further losses. The result of the Battle of Little Bighorn was a crushing defeat for our forces and a pivotal moment in the 1876 Great Sioux War. The aftermath served as a harsh reminder of the formidable obstacles confronted by the 7th Cavalry. The battle not only revealed the tactical and numerical strengths of the Native American forces but also highlighted the weaknesses in our strategy and readiness. This first-hand account offers a vivid portrayal of the grim realities of the battle, offering a closer examination of the events that transpired and the sacrifices made by those involved. It stands as a tribute to the courage of the soldiers who fought and the immense difficulties they endured in one of the most significant engagements of the Indian Wars. If you're fascinated by history's untold stories and their relevance today, stay tuned for more accounts. Thank you for listening, and I hope this retelling offers a fresh perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn.